Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our panel, Mythbusting Dysphoria. My name is Eliot Olson, and I am the Trans, Intersex, and Non-Binary Program Officer at the New Haven Pride Center. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm so excited that you can join us. So before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shagaticoke, Golden Hill, Pawcatucket, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. We hope from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose land you occupy and the history of the place you are in. Find out more about Native lands at native-land.ca. So today's panel, Mythbusting Trans Dysphoria, we're going to be talking about some common myths just surrounding the trans community and really the standards of care and how they were originally created for trans people and how those myths still live on today, even though we are 50 years since then. Finally, before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors who made today's program possible. Thank you to Connecticut Humanities for all of your support. Your support helps facilitate important conversations like this one. If you would like to know more about sponsoring our programs like these, please feel free to reach out. And I would also like to thank Anchor Health for supporting us. We just have so much love, and thank you, thank you, thank you. So let's jump in. I'd like to introduce our panelists today, Ace Ricker, Rowan Hepps-Keeney, and KC. If y'all want to maybe take a moment, name, pronouns, what you do, feel free. I will call on you. I'm not afraid.
I can go first. Hi, my name is Rowan. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently stationed in San Diego. I went to Columbia, and that was sort of when I first started exploring trans education and also my own trans identity. And currently I work as an immigration consultant at an immigration law firm.
Awesome, thank you.
I can go next. My name is Ace Ricker. I use he, him pronouns. I have been fortunate to be a public advocate and educator for the last 15 plus years. I started off doing a lot of my education and advocacy work when I was pretty darn young with Planned Parenthood, marching on Washington for women's rights, and started really finding my identity also within that dynamic, as well as doing a cumulative degree that I did at UConn called Gender in the Workplace, which I had to project against and defend to the board there, which really looks at the dynamics of policies and procedures within corporations to be more diverse and inclusive.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Ace and Rowan. Nice to meet y'all. I'm KC. I'm a professor. I teach communication at Southern Connecticut State University. And I'm also a cartoonist. I use he, him pronouns. Ooh, and Ace, I have a matching mug, but I'm not drinking out of it right now. So yeah, really glad to be here for this conversation today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm so happy I got y'all all in the room to talk about this. Especially because KC, we're really doing the podcast with you about myth busting around the trans community really is what sparked my mind for this a little bit. And I think Dysphoria is a really kind of great place to start for that conversation, just because, and I say this with love, the kind of the gender 101 that we tell our friends and family a lot of the time doesn't really explain the complexities of, how we feel about ourselves, about our bodies. And so I kind of just want to untangle the Gorgon's knot of that a little bit. And hopefully somebody learned something along the way. But yeah, just to start off really simple, and if you're comfortable sharing personal experience, that is awesome. If you just want to share, as an educator as well, for the community, but like what does dysphoria mean to you? And I found a quote from the American Psychiatric Association, so I'll bring that up in a second. But yeah, just what does dysphoria mean to you, and how would you kind of describe it?
I can start for this question. So, dysphoria to me is just the dynamics of how I personally see myself in certain obstacles I might face with how I see myself, my self-esteem, and so forth. And I know that with talking to you, Eliot, previously, I've been fortunate in a lot of ways to not deal with a directly body dysphoria. Prior to having top surgery, I was still very, very okay with my body, and where dysphoria started to kind of manifest itself was the discomfort of other people around me, in the fact that they weren't comfortable with who I am and how I identify as a trans man. And that started manifesting dysphorias on, well, why are people treating me different? Because they perceive me a certain way because of how they perceive my body. And that started off very young, especially with bathrooms. Big thing. I've personally have been verbally and physically assaulted in bathrooms, as well as we'll probably get more so into it. Sorry, the squeak is from the little mouse toy. The dysphoria that I have kind of also been manifest is based on the constant pressures of society pushing what gender agendas they want to compare you to and put you in a box. So I know we'll probably get more into that, but that's a lot where my dysphoria came from, and how it emanated was not directly myself, but people around me and how they perceived how I should be acting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. That I think one of the main things I think about with dysphoria is there's sort of the internal and the external factors. And so obviously both are, impacted by one another, but I think that's something that needs to be talked about more, is the ways that you see yourself is affected by how others see you, and how others see you is affected by how you see yourself, and sort of that vicious cycle. So I know one thing I really struggle with around dysphoria is, what do I want to wear today? What does my gender feel comfortable wearing today? And how do I want to present myself, versus what is that going to mean in terms of how I'm going to be treated by the public, or by my coworkers, or, whoever it is that I'm interacting with. And so that's something I think about a lot when I'm getting ready for something, is who am I going to be interacting with today? And is that something that's worthwhile to me? Maybe wearing something that feels closer to how I want to express myself, but might leave me subject to more harassment or stares, or, that sort of thing. And how that plays into my own dysphoria. So there are some days where I'm feeling more dysphoric purely because I don't feel like I'm presenting myself in the way that I feel most comfortable. But I need to do that for safety reasons, or because I just can't deal with it today. And that is really complicated, especially as a non-binary person. It is not super possible for me to get gendered correctly by strangers, because unfortunately we don't yet live in a society where people are going to just use gender neutrality. And so it will either be a he or a she. And from my own personal experience, it's 99% of the time a she, just because I have not chosen to go on hormones. I wear makeup most of the time. I paint my nails. I'm 5'1". So these are all sort of signifiers that to the world signifies me as a woman, despite the fact that that's not how I identify. And so that can be its own level of dysphoria. I can be feeling super amazing and awesome about how I am presenting. I've been really getting more and more in touch with like wearing dresses and being more comfortable with my own femininity after, you know, swinging in lots of different directions over the years. And that's felt really amazing. But, you know, what comes along with that is another level of discomfort being she'd, and knowing that that is ultimately more likely when depending on, you know, how feminine I'm expressing myself that day. So I think that's one thing that comes up for me a lot when we talk about dysphoria is I've always really wondered, you know, for myself personally, but also in general, if I lived in a society that, you know, didn't have gender roles, didn't have misogyny and racism and fat phobia and all of these things, would I feel dysphoric? I don't think that I would. I don't think that's something that I personally would have experienced. It's not something that I was able to name until I was much older and was very much steeped in trying to fit into a box. And that was a lot of, I judged myself a lot for that when I decided that I wanted to get top surgery. There was a lot of internal strife where I was like, well, I can be a non-binary person who has boobs. Like, I know that. I know there are lots of non-binary people who have boobs. They're not any less non-binary. Why do I feel like I need to do this for myself? Is it for other people? Is it for me? It was very stressful, you know, and I felt like I was kind of reifying these understandings of what gender is, and ultimately had to get to a place of realizing that no matter where it was coming from, that was something that I needed to do for myself to feel more comfortable. And that the reality is we do live in a society where all of those things exist. And it was getting to the point where, you know, having my chest the way that I was making me miserable. And I had to make a decision to stop judging myself for that. And just being like, it's okay that these thoughts have come in and have affected me and have affected the way that I see my body. I'm a human, and if this is something that I want to do to make myself feel better on a day-to-day basis, that's okay, even if it doesn't, you know, perfectly align with exactly how I would want to see the world and to see my body. So I think those are the main things that come up for me around, like, what is dysphoria?
I mean, one of the things that I was going to say about dysphoria really is just how complicated it is. And I'm sure that you're hearing that in what Rowan has shared, what Ace has shared, really complicated. And also, so the way I experience dysphoria really is like a sense of dissonance and friction in terms of who I know myself to be and how I see myself, and how that's like reflected back. So there's an internal element, there's an external element, like both Ace and Rowan were talking about. And it often is I'm just reminded in hearing both of you share actually that there's such a weight to, you know, there's even like, there's deciding like, all right, so how am I going to do today? Right? Like, how am I going to dress today? How am I going to interact with people today? So you're making decisions like before you even sort of move into public spaces. And then throughout that whole time, it's sort of like a filter. And I remember before I started hormones, that often for me meant not talking, because I knew that my voice would, quote unquote, give me away. But it's really, there's this component where sometimes, like, if I'm misgendered in some moments, that actually doesn't trigger dysphoria for me. Most of the time it does. But I just like, it's so complicated. Actually, it's really hard even for me to talk about. It's an experience of being like, I know how I want people to see me. I know how I want to see myself. And if those things are not aligned, it's really uncomfortable, really painful. And sometimes that is a loop like within my own self and experience. And then sometimes that comes from, moving through the world in external places. But when you think about trans folks, non-binary identities, the real complexity, like I feel like we're having an explosion of like sexual identities, orientations, gender orientations. Like there's so much that's happening that's making things so complicated in a beautiful way, like letting people have a bigger, a more diverse human experience. And then like traditionally, like medical diagnosis dysphoria really is based on super old school ideas of like, like you're born into the wrong body, and then Ace was talking about like, actually, I don't really have body dysphoria. My stuff is coming from other people. But so, yeah, I think that a lot of those myths around dysphoria versus how trans non-binary folks actually experience dysphoria, I think that's maybe something we can unpack. Like, what is the sort of gender 101 you were talking about, Eliot, that people first like get a hold of, and then actually that most of us are like, ooh, it's not quite like that, like that's 101, but we're like, we're going to take you, I guess, to grad school today.
I like the way you put that. Yeah, no, for sure. Just like hearing everybody's answer, it's a deeply personal experience, right? And I guess to reiterate kind of what I was saying with the 101 is, so right, the American Psychiatric Association defines dysphoria, gender dysphoria, they have it, quote, psychological distress resulting from an incongruence between the sex assigned at birth and your gender identity. And that's pretty broad. It's also a little vague. But just like Casey was saying, this 101 is very much tied to only bodily things, right? And I think all of y'all really hit the nail on the head where it's like, well, maybe my dysphoria is from how you are looking at my body, because I'm fine. And I think that's kind of like a black sheep in the room whenever we're trying to talk to trans allies, because I don't know. It's like, born in the wrong body. Okay, you're switching. That makes sense. You're just correcting what needed to be corrected. And while that's a great first step to understanding what it's like to be trans, it's not correct for a lot of people. And if that's where your understanding stops, you don't really have an understanding. And Asa, I love that you were talking about just how people, and Rowan, you were talking about this too, how it's dressing up for the day, right? Like how do I need to be perceived today? And I know I've definitely had this for myself, especially for job interviews. Actually, I was like, I'm gonna be so butch, like there's gonna be no jewelry. I'm gonna talk about sports. It's just things that aren't necessarily in my wheelhouse every day. And I do want to mention real quick as well that today's panel, just because of who we have today, we pardon me, because of the composition of the panel, we don't have any trans women on the panel, and so it's not like we're talking about everyone's experience here. Because even if we did, we still wouldn't have everybody's. It's very individual and it's very per person. But yeah, I think the next place I kind of want to go, because we already were going there, was the origins of dysphoria. So Casey, you talked a little bit about the Harry Benjamin standards of care, and then WPATH. And so like originally when that was created, plus 50 some years ago, if you are trans, You can't be gay. If you are trans, and this still sticks around, you have to live as your gender identity for a year before you can do anything you want to do. You need to get a letter from a therapist being like, you have this condition. And while some of it's gone out the window, a lot of it hasn't still. Sorry, I'm reading the comments while I'm talking, if my eyes shift. So I think a lot of that narrative in today's culture around understanding and caring for trans people just within the medical community, right, it places the body dysphoria as the number one thing, as that is how we are counting you as trans. Whereas when you actually talk to trans people, the body portion of it, while present, isn't the crux. It's how everyone else is looking at us, which I think, I don't know, I think we all kind of said in different ways. And I kind of just want to dig into that a little bit deeper, because that's not something I think a lot of people have heard. Most people are like, you're uncomfortable with your body, so I'm gonna reaffirm everything about your body, where it's like, maybe the fact that you think you need to do that is where I'm getting a little anxious. So yeah, just talking about the relation between public perception and personal experiences of dysphoria. Like I know we started that, and touching on WPATH care, I'm kind of curious how you all have explained it to other people, whether you're talking to someone who's maybe just coming out, or just trying to explain it to someone who has no idea what you're talking about. Have you found yourself kind of slipping into the born in the wrong body narrative, and how successful have you been in stepping away from that? Yeah, I think that's a good place to head.
I can start. I think that's a narrative that I've found that's really has been really hard for a lot of people I've known who have just started coming out as trans. It's something that, within queer circles and trans circles, I hear a lot of like, well, I haven't been in a queer relationship yet, so I can't, use that identity. I don't want to take up space in that community because I haven't, dated a man yet, or, I don't feel queer enough, I don't fit into these circles. I don't, have rainbow hair, or, whatever it is. And with trans folks, I have heard a very similar, like, well, I don't hate my body, so I can't be trans. I can't identify that way. I don't want to take up space in the trans community. And I think that comes from a lot of places, but it's really hard to hear, because I think the last thing that unites us as a trans community is the idea of hating our bodies, and for that to be sort of the quintessential thing that's like, okay, if you hate your body, you're trans. Like, first of all, there are a lot of people in the world who have a lot of complicated feelings about their bodies in all sorts of different ways, on all the different isms that, inflict our society. So that's one element. But another is sort of what you were talking, what we've all been touching on here, is that we all have complicated relationships with our bodies, but boiling it down to all trans people hate their bodies is so far from accurate, in my experience, and is definitely not an all-encompassing experience in any way. There is just so much of it that's about public perception. I know a lot of trans folks, including myself, who, I feel least dysphoric often when I'm naked. I'm going to Mexico soon, with my fiance, and the place that we go to that her family owns is deserted. There's no one there. And so when we go, we're usually naked a lot of the time. All of our friends go skinny dipping, like all of those things. And that is a really euphoric experience for me, because, there's no like, oh, this shirt is going to tug on my hips in this specific way, or, you know, clothes say so much about your gender and your presentation and all of these things, and how you accessorize, and sometimes just being stripped down to just being like, this is just my body, it is the way that it is, and like there's nothing complicating this or, you know, adding another element, is when I actually feel the most comfortable. So saying that trans people are, you know, were born into the wrong body, or whatever it is, you know, I've heard a lot of pushback against that, and things that are like, no, I wasn't born into the wrong body. I was born into a society that doesn't understand my body and is trying to categorize it in a way that is uncomfortable and inaccurate. So I think that's much closer to the way that a lot of trans folks would say that they experience that. And yeah, I think it's really important that we talk more about all of the ways that dysphoria can present itself, because for a lot of people, it's not a tangible, like, oh, I look in the mirror and I'm like, yep, I hate this part of my body and I hate this and I wish it looked like this other body part that it could be, you know. That's not how a lot of us experience it, especially on a day-to-day basis. And I think that has prevented a lot of people that I know from feeling comfortable embracing their identity, and taking up space in a way that they absolutely should, but they don't feel comfortable because they're like, there's this very clear narrative of, you know, born in the wrong body, and that's not how I feel. I love my body. How could I be trans if I love my body? And I really think we should start encouraging the fact that a lot of trans people do love their bodies, and we should, and that's incredible and amazing. And the joy of getting to love your body, and that doesn't have to be every day, and that doesn't have to be every part of your body, but embracing that and making sure that people know that that is not, by and large, our community experience.
So Rowan, what you were saying about the born in the wrong body narrative, I was talking recently to my friend Tony Ferriolo, trans advocate extraordinaire. And when he's talking with youth, like, that it is such a burden to have this born into the wrong body narrative. It's like that is a recipe or an invitation to dysphoria. Like, because if you're born in the wrong body, you know, it's never going to be right. And when he's talking to youth, he's like, it's impossible that you were born into the wrong body. You were born into your body. You're born into a trans boy body. That's your body, you know, that, and that is, you know, trying to undermine or like skirt around maybe this idea. But I just think that the standard, if we have this in the wrong body idea around trans, non-binary people, like the standard is a normative cisgender body that is also able-bodied. And so that is the constant point of comparison, which is a recipe really for feeling like you're never enough, or that you're going to be found out, or that you are lesser than, you know. So there's no, like, it's such an unhealthy dynamic, I think. And I'm remembering, like, when I went to get my therapist letter, like, they want to know, like, how much have you suffered and how early did it start, you know. So we all know, like, when folks are going to a therapist to get a letter for care, like, we know the things to say. Like, we know that we have to say certain things, even though we have many different experiences, you know. Like, I may or may not have known that I was trans as a young kid. I don't know, but I know how I feel right now, and I know how I felt for like the last 15 years. But, you know, it's no secret that we know the sort of check boxes that we need to satisfy in order to get care that we need, gender affirming care. And a lot of times it's really stereotypical. And the other thing that I wanted to say was just that I really think that, and this has come up a couple times already, so many people do collapse trans identity in the body, but it really is a social, like, I mean, of course the body's always involved, we're human beings, but it's so much, when I think about my own experience, it's about like how I am who I am in public or who I am socially. That's the, of course, the body's always there, but it's really about how are people seeing and knowing me, and then how do I know myself? And the body's like a vehicle to that, but it's not, certainly not the only thing.
Especially like with what Rowan and Casey, I was writing notes vigorously down because there's so much going on, and how Rowan, when they were starting to speak about how just being in your, just no clothes, just let's free ourselves, this euphoric feeling, this dynamic, we always find ourselves then being closed in, like both Rowan and Casey was saying, by our clothes. Like right now, I'm a dork, and I fit some of those, like, let me wear a tie and look very masculine in a lot of different ways. But then a lot of times I'll go out in different attire, and when I first introduce myself, they see a very masculine individual, and they're like, okay, very straight man. And then I start talking, and I talk about many different aspects and do a lot of things, like Elliot was talking about before, talking about like going to a job interview and talking about sports, because that's what guys are supposed to talk about. And yeah, in some elements I've done sports, but then I also am a tenor in choir, and I do painting, and I sculpt, and I do poetry, and I do these quote unquote feminine things that have a gender labeled directly to them. And then we find ourselves being pushed back into these elements where our body doesn't parallel go in with how we're acting, how we express ourselves. And I know that something was said, like, in the dynamic of, well, if you identify as a certain gender or outside of gender roles, that you are then going to have everything else attached to it. That if I identify as a man, I'm going to be only specifically attracted to women. And for someone being gender queer and expressing very openly the relationship I'm in and engaged to someone who else is in the community who is non-binary, when we walk down the street, we're seen as, without, we both have rainbow hair, so we are seen as a straight couple, and then you like take a second look, and then you're like, okay, you're not a straight couple. But there's so many dynamics that we almost try to rip out of. Like, I'm always wearing my rainbow lanyard and trying to be very expressive, like, I'm queer, and I'm very open about it, because there are several people that don't feel they can be open about it, or know that there are other people around them that they feel safe. Especially with, like, what Rowan was saying about the public perception. We constantly are being pushed into these boxes and how we're supposed to act and who we're supposed to be. And being a person of color, I find more and more and more. While I was at UConn, I was the training radio announcer for their UConn radio station, and I traveled for sports as a sportscaster. And it was unfortunate because people would assume I was a white cis man based on my announcing. And then they would meet me in person, and they'd be like, Ace? And I'm like, yes. And you can clearly see that we constantly are inundated with being prejudged on so many general aspects, on what we're wearing, if we have makeup on, if we don't have makeup on, if we're with somebody that looks a certain gender, to perceive what type of relationships we're in, to what music, and so on. And then when we go back to our bodies, like what has been consistently said, is if we constantly are said, well, this is the ideal body. And I know that it's projected even when we're little. You go into a grocery store and you see all these magazines, and you see like the perfect body in these bathing suits, and the amount of Photoshop that's done on these images, to then have us growing up and being inundated with all of this material saying, okay, these are the ideals. And no one is told these ideals are impossible to reach because there's so much additives and stuff that you shouldn't have to feel you can have to commit to or try to commit to. Like, I'm a fluffy guy, and I enjoy my body as a stockier, fluffy guy. And some people may be very comfortable in their body based on that. Some people may be like, I'm not as comfortable. I want to change my body. But those dynamics of having this vast visual of like, these are all these types of bodies, all these unique features that each of us have, to then be finited into this like little teeny category of, well, this is the ideal, and I can't be a white guy, and I'm not looking to be a white guy, and all these different things, like Casey beforehand talking about how he wouldn't speak sometimes because he would feel that he would be outed based on what his voice sounded like. And I remember when I would still use women's bathrooms because I felt it was safer to use women's bathrooms comparative to men's bathrooms, even though I identify as a man. And I remember sometimes if I was washing my hands and a woman would come in the bathroom, I would say hi in a higher pitched voice. So they'd be like, okay, you're safe. I don't have to worry about you. Because if I didn't speak up, there was a situation I had where I was assaulted by a woman that felt that I was a man in the women's bathroom, which I was technically, and she felt threatened and she reacted. And that was a very unfortunate thing because I didn't want to be there as much as she felt uncomfortable, and we're forced to do that. The same dynamics with saying, well, if I'm perceived a certain way, I fall into these dynamics of who I'm going to date and who I'm attracted to. And I found growing up, I was being pushed like, well, are you sure you're a guy? Have you been with guys yet? Have you done sexual stuff? And it got to the point where there was so much push by people that somebody, like, this is a slight trigger for some people, that someone attempted to rape me to see that I needed a cis man to figure out my identity. And it happens too often that someone else is trying to push us in a certain direction when we already know where we're going. We see our bodies, we love our bodies, and what's causing this dysphoria, what's causing these perceptions of ourselves, or the negative perceptions of ourselves, is not based on our own opinions of ourselves, but the opinions that other people have. And then you add all these other intersectionalities that each of us have, and then you add an even more complex equation that all of us have stated, and then having to explain that, especially to people that don't want to listen, in a couple seconds, if not minutes, is almost nearly impossible. And that's why we have these panels, because it's not simple, and it is a conversation that is a sit-down conversation to just be open to say, okay, I have more than a couple minutes to listen to you because I already disagree with you. And that there has to be a process of listening instead of just yelling at each other.
Ace, that's exactly why I make comics, because a lot of these, like, to be able to not like trick people into reading things, but people do tend to read comics that are in front of them. You know, they're not going to like maybe sit down and read like a giant book, but a lot of these experiences happen wordlessly, and they happen really fast, and they happen in public spaces. And you can really break that down in comics, but trying to express that in as many different ways as possible, like what are these experiences like, to sort of break it down in a way that people can understand and relate to. Because yeah, a lot of times like the door is just sort of closed, or people just have no idea what's going on, like no idea whatsoever. So yeah, I'm really glad that we're talking about this today.
I saw some comments earlier, just kind of crossing the bottom of the screen, and I'm sorry for whoever said this. I can't remember the name that was attached, but like the definition and what we have in the DSM as like gender dysphoria, that's written by a cis person. And that's so wild to me, because I'm like, you have no access to this literally at all. And so like whether the purest of intentions, it will never be able to be fully articulated in a way that is matching to reality for the community. And so because of that, the beginning of how dysphoria was kind of articulated, again, medical communities was kind of right where that was happening. But then, like y'all are saying, in the minute, in the 30 seconds we have to explain who we are, whether that's to a friend or someone in a bathroom who is frightened, your only thing to rely on is kind of like this one-on-one narrative, because no one wants to pause enough to listen, whether they're even going to question themselves, which is already rare as well. I did see that Mel commented that trans bodies aren't the broken things, the binary gender system is, and like all of the steps for that. It is like, there's a tagline for this. That is the tagline, I feel like, in a lot of ways. Give some tips they have for trans people who are figuring out what feels affirming to them. Yeah. That is a great question. What feels good and right? If anything comes to mind for y'all, feel free to jump in.
I have some thoughts.
Yeah.
So one piece of language that I've been using recently that I've heard from others has been very helpful, and it's been really helpful for me to contextualize, was, a little while ago, I was talking to my boyfriend, and they were just sort of being like, have you thought about growing your hair out again? Have you considered that? I was sort of moving more, exploring more of my femininity and stuff like that, like I talked about. And as soon as he asked that, I was like, that would be very complicated for my slider. And so I've been using this language of your gender expression sort of being a slider, where I was just sort of like, I've got things at a comfortable place where I've sort of figured out where I am right now, and different things that feel good on a day-to-day basis. If I were to grow my hair out, my slider would change completely. Like, all of a sudden, these items of clothing which feel really good and, a perfect combination of androgyny in whatever way are totally different, because I've got a completely different hairstyle. And so I found that that's been something that's been really helpful, is sort of thinking about that slider and trying to find, to make sure that your slider is where it feels comfortable for any given day. And, there's sort of like the short-term slider, which is like a day. And then there's kind of like long-term, like, do I have access to the types of things that are feeling good? And, what are the different things that I've been exploring? So that's been something that's been really helpful for me. Also, just changing the language away from dysphoria, because sometimes, I don't know about all of you, but focusing on dysphoria, again, because it's complicated and it's got a very pejorative, negative connotation to it. Instead of being like, I'm having a really bad dysphoria day, because that feels hard and feels big and can sometimes make me feel more overwhelmed, just being like, my slider feels off today. And I'm trying to get it back to a better place. That's the other thing I like about the slider, is it's very fluid, and it moves a lot. It's not great because it's linear one direction to another. It's not necessarily meant in a like masculine feminine slider, just like it moves around on its axis, wherever its axis is. And so I like that, of also just sort of like giving myself the opportunity of like, I'm trying to move my slider back into a direction that feels good. And that, instead of getting bogged down in like, today is just a day of dysphoria, and that's just the way that it is. And, it's like, I'm trying to figure out what would feel better today. And that can be a myriad of different things. That could be going to a nude beach, and that will feel better. Maybe that's, going rollerblading, or, maybe that will help my slider feel better today. Maybe that's, putting on, it doesn't have to be a like physical, like, let me change what my gender presentation is from like a clothes accessories perspective. It can also just be like let me do something that feels better to my body, whether that's, sitting on the couch and watching my favorite TV show, or going outside, or making art, or doing comics, or, something like that. That can also change my slider on a daily basis, because yeah, again, it's this internal external thing where it's like there are the external perceptions of like, this is a feminine activity, or this is a masculine activity, or whatever it is. But also it's your own internal stuff of like, my gender feels like baking cookies today. And for some reason that feels really affirming to my gender. Like, it has nothing to do with anything. Like, no one else is seeing it. It's just me alone in my kitchen with these cookies. And yet for some reason, I feel better about where my slider is because I spent today making these cookies that I get to give to my friends and being like, look, I made this thing, So that's something that's been helpful for me, is not getting bogged down in like the physical, like what clothes am I wearing, that sort of thing. That can be important, but looking at it more broadly as a like, okay, something feels off with my slider today. How can I fix that? And when talking about, sort of the macro things that are more permanent, like hair. Like if you are going about your daily life and you are feeling like your slider is just constantly off, and it's like, no matter what I do, no matter what clothes I put on, no matter what combination of masculine, feminine, whatever, it still doesn't feel right. Maybe there's something else, that you need to take another look at in terms of, your more permanent things that you could change, like get a tattoo maybe, or is your hair feeling off in some way, or do you want to start thinking about like hormones or different things like that? Like if you're going every single day and you're just like the slider is never where it is meant to be, looking at a bigger scale of being like, okay, maybe it's not my clothes, maybe there's something else that I need to take a look at. Maybe I haven't been getting enough sleep and that's why the slider is feeling off. They could be a myriad of different things. So I think that has been a really helpful element for me. And then, yeah, another thing that can be really helpful, if you have the privilege of having a partner or a live-in person who, a roommate or a friend who is supportive. I get very anxious when I am in a moment when I'm like trying to pick out clothes and it's not going the way that it should be going. I will just sort of end in this spiral. I'll start like sweating and like need to sit down. And having my fiance there is really helpful because she knows me well enough to know what I need in that moment, and to just kind of be like, okay, what are your like favorite go-to things that will always like kind of make you feel good, because I know that I in those moments get overwhelmed by like trying to make decisions, and having someone else there to be like, okay, I've decided, like, this is something that you're going to try, and I can veto it and be like, nope, I'm not doing that. Like, that's not it. But even that is helpful feedback because it's like, oh, okay, what about this is not feeling like the thing? Like, where did we go wrong with the slider? How can we get it to a better place? And just having someone to bounce that off of is really, really helpful as well.
I think for my dynamic, definitely what Rowan has been saying. They have the great dynamic with the slider and how we constantly are changing, whether that's in a day, whether that's within an hour, whether it's something we're wearing, whether it's let's bake cookies. Like I love cooking. And those dynamics are always there, especially with something that I actually started right before COVID is actually doing drag. So I'm do androgynous drag as just my name is Mix Understood, and I do political drag. And so something that really kind of puts me back into the dynamic is probably getting really activist. It's not a word, but activisty, and really like there's stuff that's happening and we need to talk about it. And to push that envelope for me is something that I feel I can reach out to other people that might feel their conversations they want to have are taboo, and with drag you can kind of, in a sense, open that up in a very, like, I'm not talking directly at you, but I'm opening up to an audience, like, hey, food for thought. As well as the dynamics of whether it's cooking, whether it's putting on clothes, having other individuals who reaffirm, like what Rowan said, having their fiance, their significant other, specifically knowing, like, hey, they're sitting down, they're getting a little anxious, let's change this dynamic, is, if a real positive thing is, if reaching out to others, like we choose our family and we choose those individuals who know and can and perceive how we're reacting and feeling. And if we kind of can't figure out, like what Rowan was saying, why our slider seems off, then reaching out, like, to my partner, usually be like, I don't know why you're anxious, but you're anxious, go mow the lawn or something. Because if I do something outside or build something, that's a positive thing that I focus on. It's like creating something, whether it's sculpting or building. I find that that's a big positive thing for me. Yeah, like what Rowan was stating, it doesn't directly have to be something I'm wearing. It's something that I feel that there's an accomplishment of something that I can control. Right now, I might not be able to figure out exactly why I feel off, but let me go build a bird feeder. I built a bird feeder a couple of days ago. Like, I built a bird feeder, I painted it, it was pretty and everything, and I could recenter my mind, in a sense, to where I wanted to direct it. And a lot of times, you definitely do not want to think of any type of negative aspects, because then it just emanates, and you kind of have to pick out that positive out of all of the dynamics that are happening around you, and run with it. Even if it's this little teeny positive thing, you take a hold of that and you move forward with it. And that's what I say with a lot of individuals, is that if something doesn't feel right, don't feel that you failed in a way. Try to turn it around and look at it differently, and move in a different direction to see where it goes.
Y'all are brilliant. Really, like, this is gold. I think the most important thing, and something that, at least with certain kids who are growing up, I'm seeing like a little bit more of this, which is just the freedom and the control to try on different identities, to try on different, whether that's literally trying on different clothes or hair or ways of being, but also just for yourself, like mentally trying on different things. And ideally, and I'm just also realizing how privileged I am in this moment to have surrounded myself with almost completely affirming people. And I remember what it was like to not have that, and to have like maybe one person sometimes, and how important that is to do and to build over time, but to have folks who, when you're feeling off, who can recenter or help you recenter, whether that's bossing you around, telling you to go mow the lawn, or just seeing you and who you are. But I think, this idea that trans folks like go from point A, like here's the problem, and then like you solve the problem, then you transition, and then it's over. It's like it's actually never over. And I used to think that at some point, like, oh, you have, and people ask me that all the time. So now that you've completed your transition, I'm like, what is that? Like it's not like an end point. It's like we just keep living our lives. And a huge thing for me, with both really like holding on to and appreciating like these moments of gender euphoria and joy, and then also dealing with harder stuff, has been to make art, to make comics. There was a long time when I just really stayed small and stayed inside and stayed quiet, because I didn't want to experience all this stuff, And then once I became a cartoonist, I was like, well, if I don't experience anything, I don't have anything to make comics about. So that really sort of pushed me out for all the experiences. And then it helped me also channel something. It helped me have control of the narrative. Like, oh, this thing happened. Didn't feel awesome. But now I'm going to make a comic about it. I can draw that person however I want to. And then I can share that with people. And that, so it sort of, composts this experience into a joyful one, and one that I actually own instead of being just sort of the recipient of. But I really think that control piece and the, giving yourself some freedom to try things on, and, I feel off today, but, tomorrow I probably won't, and there are ways that we can handle that, just like Rowan and Ace have been talking about.
And that's a great thing. Just really quickly to note is that having the ability to express, whether through comics or speaking or this panel, that
or drag,
the ability for us to express ourselves, even if like we can be that quiet individual walking down the street, we're still seen within the community, and it takes away this taboo that is still very much so out there. Like, we can't talk about how we're feeling or how we're trying to conquer through how we identify or whatnot. Is that we constantly can keep changing this narrative, because it's the same thing. I might have liked like Fruit Loops when I was little, and I'm not a fan of them now. It's the same thing with our identity. Like what Casey said earlier, is that maybe I wasn't little in knowing that I was trans, but I'm trans now. I identify a certain way now, and that's what we have to look at. And a lot of times people take, specifically within the trans community, this dynamic like, well, you have to know for such this long period of time. And I'm like, there are several elements out of every community in every person's life that consistently changes. So you can't just put this acute community, like this look of like, well, they don't know this for their entire span. Well, I didn't know I wasn't gonna like Fruit Loops when I was 12 years old. When I was 32 now, like, and that's where these conversations need to be had, because we have so many assumptions put out in the world that need to be myth busted, because there's too many of them.
There are way too many of them. I know we're a bit past the hour, but I don't know. I want to put like a little asterisk next to some of the things y'all said. I freaking love the slider. It is now burned into my memory, and I know I'm going to use it every day. But I also want to touch on something you said, Casey, about like this idea that you're done transitioning, or you've completed something. So like, yeah, I've always find that idea kind of hilarious, because I'm like, I haven't stopped being me, and that was the whole goal to begin with. If I've completed that, I don't know, maybe some crazy self-actualization, I've reached nirvana and I'm sitting under a lotus tree, but I really doubt it. So yeah, it's not something that ever stops. And just to throw my own hat in the ring as well, for tips and tricks, I think the biggest thing that I would also say, that you all touched on a little bit, is community. I know the best thing for me was when I was meeting other trans people and I could talk, and I wasn't, alone with my feelings basically anymore. That doesn't mean you have to suddenly find, your group therapy session for every day of the week. That can just be, if you're of the age, going to a gay bar or something on drag night, or youth for school, GSAs, things like that. Shout out to Gender Rev at Columbia. It's really community that creates the support structure that lets us know that even if, you know, the tons of weight we're feeling, you know, is gonna crush us, the more hands, the more eyes that are there, the lighter it will be. But I do also want to say, though, there are some things that can't really be helped. They can only really be navigated with kind of like self-care stuff. Like if you are really feeling angry and down because you can't access medical treatment or hormones, like, don't feel bad about that. That is righteous anger and you should have it. So I think a lot of it is also figuring out how you can take care of yourself, and also, you know, the way you are taking care of yourself should always be in validation. Whether you're composting the bad stuff, whether you're just fixing the slider, it's all to support. You should, as soon as you're getting down the path of bashing on yourself, you know you're not going in the right direction.
That's really helpful, Eliot. Thank you for saying that. It also brings up something that I think I had a really interesting realization recently. So right after we got our 2 weeks after our second shot, my fiance and I went to go have dinner outside at an outdoor restaurant for the first time in, you know, a year and a half. And we were really excited. It was great. We were going to be around people again. We like went on this weird like boat tour. It was very exciting. And the element I forgot is that I got misgendered about 5,000 times. Like it was extraordinary. Like I have never, like this waitress could not stop. Like she would come over to us, and before, like Rachel, my fiance, would like try and cut her off so that like she wouldn't start with the ladies. Like it just became like a comedy of errors where like that was a moment that could have been really dysphoric for me, and where I could have been really like getting down on myself and really like, oh my God, like what have I done to like, and like, but it was just so clear to me in this moment that it's like, it's just this person who just seems to think that that is like the good and respectful thing to do. And for some reason, my fiance's like absolute rage made it so much funnier to me. Like in this moment that could have been like really awful, being like, God, like we've been isolated for a year and a half, and like first day out, like I am just getting misgendered, like nobody's business, like could have been really awful. But for some reason, just having one person there who was just so righteously angry on my behalf, like took this weight off of me. I was like, you know what? I don't really care. Like, it's just kind of funny to me at this point, like watching you try to just like stop her at like any given opportunity from misgendering me. And like watching you just like have this like visceral reaction means that I don't have to, because someone is angry on my behalf. And so I don't have to hold that. I can just sit here and be like, yeah, this is dumb, but like, you know, watching you like aggressively talk over this person to like make sure that whatever words come out of her mouth don't include the word ladies was very enjoyable. So I think that's another element too, is like, I know it can be really hard, but in moments when you can, trying to find the levity and the joy and like take that weight off of your shoulders and just kind of be like, you know what? At this point, this just feels like I'm in a play where it's just like this ridiculous, like that she has this objective, my fiance has this like opposite objective, and the two of them are just like butting heads, and I'm just gonna sit here and like eat my soup, and like that'll be fine. So I think that's another thing that I have found. When you are in a moment where you have the privilege of having someone else with you who is a really strong ally, and it doesn't happen all the time, and it happens way less than it should, and you know, different people are different privileged in ways to have access to that. But in the moments where you do, really taking stock and being like, damn, this feels really different when I'm not just like here by myself, and I'm not having to advocate, like I don't have to do anything, I'm just sitting here, and like feeling that love because anger is a form of love. Being angry on someone's behalf is like, I feel like anger gets this really bad connotation, but I feel so much love when someone feels angry on my behalf, and feels angry enough to do something or say something about it. So really sitting in that moment and taking that in, and noticing how your body maybe feels differently in those moments too, if you're sitting there alone, or feeling like the other person isn't having that reaction in the way that would feel good to you.
Eliot, I know you're probably trying to wrap this up, but
No, go for it.
Okay, well, just Rowan, my experience is different, but like a similar in the way that, in a moment that would typically make me feel awful, I instead felt fine, like good. But there wasn't another person there, so that wasn't the component. But it did sort of like organically happen. I was at the beach last week by myself. I had top surgery a couple years ago, and am like practicing being at the beach in small elements as a, very pale skinned person for one, but also just to practice being like shirtless at the beach before I'm hanging out with more people, including family. And, I see people staring at me. I mean, I have scars. Typically that would make me like, just want to like cover up and go home and feel sad. But it just struck me in that moment that, that is their business, whatever. I'm here. This is my body. And here I am at the beach. Look at all these other people and all their different bodies. And the fact that they're choosing to look at me, whatever they're thinking is sort of like their business. And I can choose to not have that be my business and not internalize a whole world of things which all involve feeling bad about myself, in some way or another. But that's, what? So what? Like, they're looking at me. That's their business. And it didn't feel particularly unsafe, which is because we're in a wide open public setting. So I'll just, put that part out there too. But yeah, I don't know if that is coming out of the pandemic or what, but it is like sort of shocking to be back in this world, especially as a trans non-binary person, and to feel some things that we haven't felt before. And, maybe for some folks, hopefully, like Rowan experienced and like I experienced, and maybe we can choose or experience things somewhat differently and maybe comically, like, not have to take in everyone's BS.
Yeah. And I just want to add to that, like, don't put pressure on yourself to have that reaction. It's okay if it doesn't feel funny, like this was a surprise because I hadn't really experienced that before. That is just to say, like, let yourself be open to having whatever reaction you have in those moments, and validate that for yourself, because whatever reaction you're having is okay. And you should, the best thing you can do for yourself is to validate that. And I also just wanted to address the comment about making sure, if you're advocating for a trans person, to check about what they're comfortable with. Yeah, and that was part of the conflict that was funny in that moment, is my fiance knows that I don't like people to correct my pronouns to strangers. It's just an uncomfortable thing for me. And so if that hadn't been the situation, it could have more easily been avoided. She could have just been like, "Oh, please don't, like, my partner doesn't identify as a lady. Please don't use that term." But that's not something I'm comfortable with. And so instead it just became this like passive aggressive, like trying to cut her off in the middle of a sentence thing. And so that was really important, is that she knows that that's how I feel most comfortable, and that I didn't want her to have a confrontation in front of me. So instead it just became this awkward thing where like the waiter didn't know why she kept cutting her off. And it was just this like weird back and forth. But I would have been really uncomfortable if she would have just been like, "Please stop doing that. It's very offensive." And uncut like that. I'm not comfortable with that. And she knows that. And so I think that's a really good point as well. Like making sure that your community members and your peers and your friends and your family, like how they feel most comfortable in different situations when it comes to misgendering and things like that, and checking in with them in the moment also. And that was something she also did, was being like, "What do you want me to do? Do you want to leave? Do you want, do you want me to say something?" And I'm like, we can just keep doing this. It's okay. It doesn't feel that bad right now. So really important point as well. Thank you for raising that.
And definitely with what Rowan said, when having certain feelings, like also what everyone's been saying, that in a moment, the feelings you have, make sure to validate them, but also be aware that those moments may occur again and those feelings may change. So that you may validate them at one time, like, okay, I'm angry because they're using the wrong pronouns and I feel angry. And then the same situations happens a day or a week or a year later, and you have a whole different feeling of it. Don't question yourself like, wait, but I had this feeling before. Just you can analyze the situation to a certain extent, but don't put yourself in this corner like, well, what's wrong now if I don't feel the same way? Especially like with Casey talking about going to the beach. Like, that situation might have affected him previously differently than he was like, well, screw you. Like, this is me and everyone else has a different type of body, and this is my body and I love my body, and you can love your bodies over there. And that's a big dynamic that all of us through all of our experiences have. And it's good to just reassure yourself that what you're feeling is valid and that those feelings may change in different situations.
God, I feel so much love for all of you now. It's just like, I don't know. This is a great conversation, and like I don't want to pull a stopper on it. I just want to have a longer call. But we're well past the hour at this point. So I do kind of want to wrap things up. So yeah, thank you all so much for being part of this panel, this conversation. Thank you to everybody who is watching as well. Yeah, just thank you truly from the bottom of our hearts. And thank you for joining us from the Pride Center, if I can say my last little bit, closing bit as well. It's great to have you here joining for today's program. Remember, the center is here for you year-round with dynamic programming, support services, case management, food pantries, gender-affirming closets, binders. If you're looking for binders, we can hook you up. You can find out about all of our upcoming programming if you go to newhavenpridecenter.org. And don't forget to follow us on social media, because that is truly where you will see everything. At New Haven Pride Center on Facebook, at New Haven Pride Center on Instagram, and at New Haven Pride on Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's just / New Haven Pride Center. I'm sensing a pattern here. And also for the YouTube channel, we have all of our past panels pretty much there too. So if you ever miss anything, something's coming up, but you have to work, we have an archive for you there. Finally, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider joining as a member. It is 100% free. At newhavenpridecenter.org / join now. You can make a donation as well if you're feeling a little thrifty, and support our programming. Donations, as we are a nonprofit, make panels like these happen. This only happens because of everyone watching. Thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your day, and I will see you all